G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I have a choice between videoing part 2 of background briefings, the base, out here at 15 degrees on a cold, grey, rainy or drizzly Sunday morning, or coming inside and lighting the fire and running the recording from in here. Personally, I think this is probably a better background for the radio. So I'll start off out here, and if it actually starts to rain on me, then I'll pick up sticks and we'll move inside, and there will be a brief disorganised hiatus in the middle of the recording. We shall see what we shall see.
To you and welcome back to Easter Sunday Extra with me, Julian Morrow, this morning. Great to have your company. Coming up in a moment, background briefing is on, of course, background briefing, and today we have part 2 of the special series on the inner workings of a global neo-Nazi group called The Base. After the revelations from last week's episode of Background Briefing, Labor MP and counter-terrorism expert Anne Ali called for the organisation, The Base, to be thoroughly investigated or even banned, as it has been in Canada.
Australia needs to follow suit and really take this seriously by either prescribing the base or, at the very least, recognising how serious this issue is and investigating their activities in Australia.
Today's part 2 is the final episode of The Base Tapes, and reporter Alex Mann explores the techniques used by the group to target Australian men for radicalisation and recruitment. And a warning right up front, this program contains racist hate speech and very strong language.
Somewhere in Canberra, a 17-year-old boy is logging onto an encrypted chat service. The boy's chosen to call himself Sherman.
Yeah.
When he gets there, there's a man already waiting.
Yeah, looks like we got everybody.
The man is 46, and he's the leader of a neo-Nazi terrorist group called The Base.
Okay, so this will be about 30 minutes, maybe up to an hour, depending if you have questions. So we'll give you a chance to ask questions in the second half.
The max I can do is probably 40 minutes.
Okay, well, we'll try to get it done.
The leader's name is Ronaldo Nazaro, and over the course of this year, he's had more than 100 conversations just like this one. He's audibly bored as Sherman nervously tries to boost his fascist credentials.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about yourself.
I've been into fascism and National Socialism for maybe properly for about 6 months.
What is National Socialism in your view? What does it mean?
Well, National Socialism is the worldview of the eternal truth.
What neither of them know is that the base has been infiltrated by the FBI and by anti-fascists, and that their whole conversation is being covertly recorded. I've been given access to the vetting interviews with Australian candidates. There are 5 of them, and this guy, Sherman, is the youngest of them all.
I wouldn't say I'm old enough to be into the proper real world yet.
It's the 3rd of November 2019, and Sherman is still in high school. He's young and he sounds it. His answers are awkward.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm not 18 yet. That's not an issue, I didn't think.
It's not an issue. Sherman is asked to elaborate on how he found the base.
I went from just the typical person with who was apolitical and things like that, through a conservative libertarian phase, then to the 4chan phase, and then to where I am now, in an actual worthy phase.
Nazaro wants Sherman to know that his group, the base, isn't messing around.
We do have law enforcement. We have a couple guys who are under investigation.
Nazaro doesn't say this, but one's under investigation for spraying a swastika on a synagogue, and one of the group's leaders will later be charged for making detailed plans to murder anti-fascist activists. Sherman tries to distance himself from the idea of violent action. Mazzaro reassures him.
We're not doing anything illegal, but because of who we are ideologically, what we represent, they want to shut us down however they can.
He tells Sherman because of that scrutiny, there are risks to getting involved.
We're looking for guys who are willing to take on that risk because they feel that the mission is important enough and they want to be, and participate strongly enough that they're willing to take on that degree of risk.
I'm going to look at the two youngest Australians who applied to join the base, Sherman and this next guy who's only slightly older. I just can't get his interview out of my head.
William, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, hey, hello.
He calls himself William, or Roo-Reich-88. Roo as in kangaroo, and Reich as in Third Reich. And the 88 is a common in-joke in these circles. It's code for Heil Hitler.
Okay, you good to go?
Yeah, I'm good to go.
All right, excellent.
Where Sherman was just 17, this guy is 21. And where Sherman was nervous and awkward on the phone, this guy is more confident. And I should give a warning here. He speaks with a visceral racist hate.
I've seen and experienced and talked to enough Muslims to just know, I fucking hate them. And they don't deserve to be here, period.
Roo-Reich-88 is doing this interview less than a year after an Australian terrorist murdered 51 people at a mosque in Christchurch. The way he talks about the murderer is extremely hard to listen to.
So when Terrence did what he did, and everyone's saying he's an alt-right fascist Nazi, blah, 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 I'm like, well, if that's what he is, then okay, I'll just be that. If you want me to be the boogeyman, then I guess I'm the fucking boogeyman as well, because I fully, wholeheartedly agree with what he did.
After a candidate leaves the call, the senior leadership group stays on to discuss the merits of their application. And it's here that they give the deepest insights into their recruitment strategy. When Sherman hangs up, all of them agree. The young candidate's age is no barrier.
So it's not like a disqualifier at all. It's a general, but yeah. But sometimes that's a good thing because young people, they're more motivated and ready to make changes. Yeah, and people who are going to be more hardcore are going to tend to be skew on the younger side of things. So these younger guys, I like them. I mean, I look at them as guys that we should help develop because they're going to be the vanguard in the future.
In this episode of The Base Tapes, I'm going to unpack the interviews with the two youngest Australian candidates. I'm going to scour the recordings for clues that will help identify the young men. I want to talk to them and the people they know. This time, I'm going to lean heavily on my contacts. I'm going to speak to former insiders, underground researchers, and other investigative journalists. With their help, I'm going to lay out how groups like The Base target these young guys, how they actively seek to groom them, radicalize them, and eventually recruit them to their cause. This is part 2 of The Base Tapes.
They want kids as part of their movement because they want to be able to get people who are committed.
This whole interview process is about their preclusion to violence. What they're testing is whether or not these men who want to join this group are ready for a fight.
He was completely different to how he used to be, and it felt threatening. I felt scared in his presence.
Look, are you recording this or something?
Yes, right now I'm recording. Yeah.
You're not using my name, are you?
I think there's a very good chance that we'll be able to uncover them. Kevin Ewan is an ABC colleague of mine.
They go without a roof, I think, some farms.
Track down the people on the calls.
Oh, he's the daddy of them all.
There's probably not that many people that fit their descriptions. Based off the initial look, some of their OPSEC or operational security.
He says there are some key details in the two youngest recruits' interviews, Roo-Reich and Sherman, that I need to pay special attention to.
For example, one likes a very particular kind of martial arts.
That's Roo-Reich. And after a quick search, Kevin's figured out that the other guy, Sherman, is really into playing video games. And he uses the same nickname when he plays.
And you'd think that would be just a very common name, but based on the games that he plays, not really.
At this point, there's something else you should know about Kevin. He grew up playing a ton of video games. He still does. So when Kevin says that Sherman's gaming info is going to help, I can tell he already knows where to go looking. So you're going to have a look into him?
Yes, I will.
We'll search for Rureich and Sherman, like with every one of the guys who tried to sign up to the base under a fake name, is painstaking. And there's no guarantee it'll be successful. I leave Kevin to track down some clues online, and I go back to the recordings again. It's important to know who these guys are, but what I also want to know is how they first made contact with the base. I mean, how does a 17-year-old school kid from Canberra decide he wants to join a neo-Nazi terrorist group? Luckily, that's a question he was asked during his interview.
So why do you want to join the base? Well, first, how did you hear about the base?
Fascist Forge from Matthias' post about it in Australia.
But what the hell is Fascist Forge? And who the hell is Matthias? There's a guy I know who might just have the answers.
I'd first heard about Matthias in 2019.
Ali Winston is a freelance journalist and researcher based in New York.
His name had started popping up in connection with the base in Fascist Forge.
It turns out that Matthias is actually one of the founders of this virtual meeting place called Fascist Forge.
Fascist Forge is an online platform where young fascists, extreme right-wingers would come together and basically discuss their ideology, discuss world events, seek out like-minded people.
Sherman, the guy we're tracking, wasn't the only teenager hanging out on Fascist Forge. The UK's youngest ever terror offender was there too. He was a 15-year-old right-wing extremist from Durham.
He was trying to build a homemade bomb.
Ali says Fascist Forge worked kind of like a funnel, radicalizing young kids via torrents of memes and race hate, and then organisations like the base would be waiting at the other end, ready to recruit them. So Ali and a BBC journalist went looking for the founder of the forum, Matthias.
We had some clues about where he lived. We had some clues about what he looked like. I mean, it was just kind of triangulating the information, the scraps that I was able to get about the guy.
Ali was also scouring the base vetting interviews.
Matthias. Yeah, he seems alright. He's definitely a talker.
He was on every single call that we listened to for the base's recruitment. And his role in recruiting minors was, he was very specifically involved in that.
Matthias created and distributed online propaganda for the base through his forum, Fascist Forge. It was one of his posts that served as Sherman's first entree into the group.
He wanted the organization to expand as far as possible, including to Australia.
In the end, a tip-off from an insider gave up Matthias's real identity.
Matthias's real name was Matthew Bakari. He was a young man in his 20s from San Bernardino, Southern California.
Once they had a name, they tracked him down. And how did Matthias react when he was confronted?
He didn't come out.
Hi, can we speak with Matthew Bakari? Is he available?
Yeah, I could hear them talking upstairs.
Yeah.
It sounded like.
Yeah, so definitely he wasn't asleep.
He didn't come out of his parents' house. He sent his mother downstairs to answer the door. Show what a big man he is.
How often do you see kids, young people, people under the age of 18 pop up?
All the time, mate. All the time. All the time. They want kids as part of their movement because they want to be able to get people who are committed to the movement and have them in it for the long run. I think it is a deliberate process of radicalization. I think it is grooming. They're looking to cultivate this ideology in people who, frankly, may have had some, YouTube rabbit hole or social media, wormhole that they went down that took them down this path. But yeah, youth recruitment is 100% an integral facet of the neo-fascist movement.
I'm at home when I get a text from Kevin. He says he's made a breakthrough on Sherman. By triangulating Sherman's unique username with the niche games he played, Kevin's found his gaming profile and his friends list. He's tracked down one of Sherman's school friends. This guy is happy to talk, but he doesn't want to be identified, so we'll call him Kyle.
Hey,
He says he met Sherman in year 7. How did you become friends?
We became friends by a common bonding over Star Wars at the time.
The name Sherman comes from a video game they used to play together called World of Tanks.
It's named after the particular tank that he enjoyed playing as the most and one of his favorite tanks in history.
Kyle noticed Sherman's thinking become more radical when they were about 13 years old. He says later on, Sherman was dobbed in by someone for posting messages in support of the Christchurch terrorists to social media.
I wasn't particularly brave enough to go and dob him in. I was afraid that if I had dobbed him in, that he would know that it was me and some sort of scuffle would have occurred.
Were you scared of him?
To some extent, I was scared of him. I was scared of who he had become in 2019. He was completely different to how he used to be, and it felt threatening. I felt scared in his presence. I do believe that maybe, just maybe, there might be a small glimmer of hope that he might turn around. But at the same time, like I said, I don't know for certain anymore. The way that he got in year 11 was it was so far into it, and from what you've told me, he's so far into it that maybe there just isn't any way to bring him back. I don't know.
Sherman's interview with the base's leadership happened in late 2019. He was just 17 then, and as far as we know, he never went past the interview stage to become a member of the base. So maybe his thinking has changed by now. It looks like we might be about to find out, because shortly after we find his friend, we find Sherman himself. Kevin's got a phone number, so we give him a call. So, here we go. We've chosen not to identify Sherman because he wasn't an adult when he did that interview for the base. And for legal reasons, we've only recorded Kevin's side of the call.
It's ringing.
When Sherman picks up, he answers to his real name.
Hello? Hey, how are you? I'm well. Thanks for asking. Hey, my name's Kevin. I am a reporter with the ABC. I just wanted to ask you why you tried to join the base.
But he denies everything, including using the name Sherman online. He keeps saying he's busy and asking Kevin to call him back.
All right, speak soon. So, yeah, that went actually basically how I expected. We will try and call him back later, see how he is, but he's probably freaking out. When I said it was for ABC, he kind of went quiet. Went, right, ABC.
We sent Sherman a detailed list of questions, but he hasn't responded. And when we tried calling him back, the number was disconnected.
Please check the number and try again.
After nearly 2 months of digging through archived social media posts and approaching the people that we've identified on the tapes, Kevin and I have had a lot of experiences like that. We spent so much time listening to the voices of these guys, but when we finally approach them, either by phone or in person, the conversations are short, they're full of denials, and that's if the person speaks to us at all. Now there are just 2 people left to identify on the tapes, Rureich and Volkskrieger. And it looks like we've had a breakthrough on Rureich. If you don't remember who that is, he's the one who said this.
Like, I fucking hate them, and they don't deserve to be here, period.
With the exception of probably the leaders of the base themselves, this is the one person that I am least forward to meeting in person.
You're looking least forward to meeting them?
Yeah, or like kind of making contact with them.
Why is that?
It's just the tone in the tapes, it's the wording in the tapes, you know? It's just some of the things that some of the others the 2 people that I spoke to told me. The other ones I could kind of understand, I suppose. But this one, I don't know. Menacing, I think is the word that I would use.
Using archived social media posts provided to us by anti-fascist researchers, the White Rose Society, Kevin and I have been able to cross-reference the information we found through our own investigation.
And now that's led us to a 22-year-old on the Gold Coast named Cody. Kevin and I decided to give him a call. Okay, let's give this a go. I'm fully expecting this to last about a minute. Oh, hi there. It's Alex here. Sorry. Is this Cody? Hey, mate. Look, my name's Alex Mann. I'm from the ABC. I'm just calling to ask you a couple of questions about the base and about why you tried to join the base towards the end of 2019, early 2020. And he just hung up. In the end, the call lasts even less than a minute. That's even shorter than the call with Sherman. But then my phone starts ringing, and I instantly recognize the number. I run across the office, back into the studio, and hit record. It's Cody.
Look, are you recording this or something?
Yes, right now I'm recording. Yeah.
You're not using my name, are you?
Look, we have your name. Yep.
Right. Okay.
Can I just clarify a couple of things with you?
Okay.
So,
yeah.
Have you ever used the online name Rureich88 or William Alexander?
Yes.
This is definitely not how these things usually go. So maybe can I just ask you a couple of questions about that then? So I mean, when you
I
applied
want to know, like, is my name going to be put out there or something? Like,
at this point, the answer to that question is yes.
no, dude, why? Like, okay. Look.
Can I ask you, like, when you applied for the base, I mean, were you aware of its ideology?
I had some friends pull me into this sort of stuff, and I was aware when I was getting into it. But, like, I didn't know exactly what they did.
He says when he applied to the base, he didn't realize how hardcore it really was. But I've heard that kind of thing before, so I'm skeptical.
I don't know, when I actually talked to them, they said it was something more serious.
And did you react to that when they said that to you?
I said, sorry, I don't want a part of it. I left. I didn't want to do any harm or anything like that.
It's really hard to grapple with what Cody is saying here. Like Sherman, he was young when he applied to the base. And like Sherman, he never went through with his application. But unlike Sherman, at 21 years old, he was an adult when he applied. And now that he's asking me not to use his full name, I'm torn. I mean, his racism was so intense in that interview. He even said he supported the murder of 51 Muslims in Christchurch. That was little more than a year ago. I mean, could he have really changed that much? This is what you said, and that you agreed with what he did. How do you feel about that now? Do you still think Tarrant did the right thing?
No, I don't. I feel terrible. I went out and I sought a different view. I now have friends who are minorities. Like, I was just in a dark place, mate. Like,
so how would you describe your political views now? I mean, are you still involved with any National Socialist or white supremacist organizations?
No, 100% not. I left. I fully have left. I've, like, not had any contact since.
Do you think people might think that you're just saying that now because you don't want people to find out that that's the sort of stuff that you were saying and doing?
Of course, yes. I can completely understand that.
How can you convince people that you've actually moved past this stuff?
I don't know, man. Like, I've cut them out of my life. I cut all those people out of my life. Look, even when I never did anything wrong to anyone. Look, man, I don't know how to prove it to you. I've probably confronted about a dozen people in similar circumstances to this, and no one has ever responded the way that this guy, Cody, is responding now. Look, I really am sorry. I don't believe that stuff anymore. I just had no guidance in life. I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't doing anything in my life. I felt really shit, and I didn't know why, so I took it out to the world, and rather than taking it to myself, I feel terrible about it. I really do not believe any of that shit anymore. I'm trying to make a life and a career for myself that is completely devoid of all of that. I have fully renounced all that stuff. And I know that may not sound or mean much to you, but I really do. And I really hope that you can feel the sincerity in my voice. I tell him I'll think about it, and we end the interview. I'm just switching up the recording now, so thank you very much. All right. Thank you. Bye. I'm so torn on this. I mean, I'm actually a little bit unclear about what to do next. I think there's this part of me that says that anyone who went as deep as this guy did down that far right rabbit hole kind of deserves to be held accountable and face the consequences, especially considering that he was an adult when he tried to join. But on the other hand, what if he's telling the truth, you know? And that by naming him, I push him away from the people that have helped him get to this point. And then that just marginalizes him even further. Some people are not going to like or agree with this decision, I think. But I'm not going to share his name. I think he deserves a second chance. And you know, look, if his name pops up again in the future, I'll know that he's lying, and we can have this conversation again at that point. I still find it hard to understand how these guys end up becoming so racist so young. I know that racist memes shared on sites like Facebook, Gab, and Fascist Forge are this crucial pathway for radicalization. But now I want to know exactly how the recruiters use them. What I really need to do is speak to the base's Australian recruiter, Volkskrieger.
Volkskrieger, can you say something real quick? Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah, I got you.
This is the guy who said the movement should be targeting young people.
Because young people, you know, they're more motivated and ready to make changes.
Unfortunately, though, Volkskrieger is still proving hard to track down. But I have found someone else who used to do the same kind of work in far-right groups.
Yeah, just call me George.
George? Sure. There are a couple of things I can't say about George. For starters, his real name. The other thing I can't say is what his exact role was in the Australian white supremacist movement.
Because I think that people could identify me if I said what role I had.
What I can say is that he used to be a senior member of a fascist Facebook group called the New Guard, and he had intimate knowledge of the group's recruitment strategies. Are you at all worried that somebody might recognize your voice and that there could be repercussions for doing this interview?
Oh, absolutely. They would see, you know, maybe my defection or my movement away from the group as sort of a betrayal to their family, a betrayal to their brotherhood. And that can come with consequences.
Despite those potential consequences, George is willing to share, for the first time, what he knows about recruitment in these groups. Are you able to describe how that worked?
Yeah, sure.
So if you're like an individual joining a group, what's the entry point?
Yeah, so usually there would be very large open groups that would just be maybe moderately right-wing, more sort of nationalistic.
But in that group, there'd be some more extreme people like George watching your behaviour.
And people who were in the more extreme groups will be monitoring the comment section, sort of keeping track of like who's really engaging with the more edgy memes.
In this world, edgy just means super offensive and racist. What happens if someone does engage with the more edgy memes? What do you do next?
So what happens next is we would message that person and say, oh, hey, we've noticed you're on this group. Would you like to meet up in person?
The next step was a face-to-face meeting. George and the senior members of his group were particularly interested in young recruits.
So people who do vetting interviews are typically looking for, firstly, sort of the age bracket. So people who are younger usually are much more trustworthy. And we would be looking for people who, are open to the more extreme sort of side of the ideology. People who could be easily swayed.
If the person passed the vetting interview, they'd be invited to a more explicitly racist group, and then another, each one more racist and hardcore than the last.
That sort of slow process of sort of marinating different people with those memes to actually sort of then being open to these new ideas about, say, a white genocide or, needing to protect European identity. It started becoming more normalized and sort of they started to accept those ideas.
It's incredible to hear this laid out in such frank detail. I've suspected this was happening in closed Facebook groups, but I've never heard someone say it explicitly. Some people would call that radicalization.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty appropriate term for it.
For years, George was fully invested in this radicalization project.
I believed, that there was a white genocide. I believed that, that immigration was going to ruin our country.
But in 2018, he started drifting away from the movement that he'd been so obsessed with. How, in the midst of this ideological crusade, does someone pop your bubble? What happened?
I think I took a step back from politics in general and just sort of try to focus on other parts of my life.
Why?
I saw myself getting way too wrapped up in politics, and I think it was taking a personal toll on, my friendships and my familial relationships and just other different parts of my life.
What kind of things happened? Can you be specific? I mean, was there something that for you really changed in that regard?
I think my parents were becoming a lot more concerned about my sort of ideological conversations that I was having with them. I think a lot of my friends were starting to distance themselves from me because I was becoming more and more extreme. I saw that, me being in this movement was going to have very detrimental sort of effects on my future career prospects.
George started suffering from anxiety and his mental health spiraled.
I think pretty much most people within the movement were very, very anxious, very, very nervous and paranoid about, what's going to happen if I stay in this movement, how much am I willing to risk?
In the end, the anxiety and paranoia became too much, and he says those feelings became a force for change. Now, he says he's disavowed those previous beliefs. Of course, I've got no way of knowing for sure if he's genuine, but in my interview with him, he wanted to send a message directly to the people who are still heavily involved in white supremacist groups.
Sometimes it's good to maybe just step back and just examine, why you're actually part of this movement. Have you listened to the other side of the argument? Have you listened to what other people have to say about a lot of these different issues? Or are you in a sort of echo chamber where, you're just being reinforced in a lot of these different beliefs and you don't actually get to see what other people have to say about these ideas?
So what should happen to the 6 Australian men who tried to join the base? And what do the tapes tell us about the threat of right-wing extremism in Australia? Dr. Anna Lee is a professor in the field of counter-terrorism and violent extremism. She's also a federal Labor MP.
What we do learn from this is, hopefully, that this is a threat that is present and imminent, and it needs to be taken seriously. We need to act now on this.
Dr. Ali also sits on the Federal Parliament's high-powered Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and she says security agencies should be going after every one of the men on the tapes.
If these were 6 men trying to join ISIS, trying to go overseas to join ISIS. If any one of those 6 men had contacted somebody who was a recruiter for ISIS, you can bet your right arm that they would all be jailed by now. There would be a major police operation and they would all be jailed by now. They would all be jailed and they would all be charged and they would be in Supermax. Right? I think this is huge and I think that the authorities need to get onto this as soon as possible.
ISIS is a prescribed terrorist organisation in Australia, so membership of that group is illegal. But so far, the base hasn't been added to the list of banned organisations. There's just one extreme right-wing organisation that's been given that status. James Patterson is a Victorian Liberal senator and the chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee. He says while he's profoundly disturbed by what he's heard on the recordings, whether the base is prescribed is not up to him.
It's not a political process. It is an independent process. It relies on the advice of agencies, and I am absolutely certain that if sufficient evidence is available, more groups like that will be prescribed as they should be. We have to make it very clear that whatever your ideology, whoever you are, if you believe that violence is a legitimate way to achieve your political objectives, then we have zero tolerance for you and we will come after you, very, very comprehensively. If you have objectionable views and you don't seek to use violence to promote them, then that is allowed in a free country as much as we might detest your views. But the moment that you express an interest in using violent means to achieve those objectives, be assured you'll be on our radar. It's not illegal to apply to join an organisation like the base in Australia. It's not even illegal to be a member. So it's hard to know what, if anything, the authorities have done about this, or what they can do. We've put questions into the Department of Home Affairs, ASIO and the AFP. None of them answered questions about the base directly. But in a speech last week at ASIO headquarters, the organisation's Director General, Mike Burgess, made clear that the face of right-wing extremism is changing.
So people often think we're talking about skinheads with swastika tattoos and jackboots roaming the back streets like extras from Romper Stomper. It's no longer that obvious. More often than not, they're young, well-educated, articulate, middle class, and not easily identified. And I'm particularly concerned about the number of 15 and 16-year-olds who are being radicalised. They are overwhelmingly male.
Labor MP Dr Anne Ali says that in the past there's been this reluctance among Australians to even talk about the possibility of right-wing terrorists.
Because somehow it's about talking about us and not them, right? You know, Muslims were always the others. It's easy to talk about the others and make them the objects of fear. When you turn it around and suddenly we're the objects of fear, that it's us, or we have to actually do something ourselves, that's a very difficult thing. What this tells us is that it's already here. Okay? There's no more time to prepare for when it comes. It's already here.
Before I go, there's just one thing left. What is the base up to now? Well, it seems like the base dissolved about 12 months ago when its founder, Ronaldo Nazzaro, was exposed. I contacted him and, amazingly, he wrote back. His answers were not surprising. He insisted the base was not a terrorist or neo-Nazi group, and insisted it was about survivalism and self-defense. He said the base never deliberately targeted minors for recruitment. And what about the base's Australian recruiter, Volkskrieger? Well, I know he travelled up and down the coast from Perth to meet face-to-face with potential recruits, vetting them just like George once did.
Mitchell? Yeah. What's wrong with him? I'm about to go to a vetting meeting with him.
I know he joined other groups to infiltrate them and bring their more extreme members over to the base.
But yeah, I'm just using it as a recruiting ground. I'm going to see where I can get. I can try and get into the leadership group and see if I can get into the initial vetting process.
And I know that he did all of this while knowing full well that the base's senior leadership was under investigation by the FBI. What I still don't know is his real name.
Call me Alexander, mate.
Alexander? Alright, sweet. Cool.
Yeah.
Kevin and I have used every online tool we've got, and we haven't found him. So now we're asking for your help. If you know anything more about this guy calling himself Volkskrieger, you can contact our team confidentially by secure email, backgroundbriefing@protonmail.com. Or you can reach us through Signal or WhatsApp on the number 0491 750 876. That's 0491 750 876. Thanks so much for your tip-offs after the last episode. You helped us identify the guy we only knew by the fake name, James Jamison. We tracked him down and talked to him, but it was only with your help that we're now able to finally name him. His real name is James Gregg. Some of the people who got in touch went to the same high school as him in Perth, and others knew him from his adult life. Some say they saw worrying signs along the way, and they were concerned about the path he'd taken. Eventually, James sent a message to us. He disputed most of the things that we've said about him, and asked that we take his name off the story. But we stand by what we've reported. Now, we just need to track down Volkskrieger. We're keen to know where he is now, because on the tapes, he did say that even if the base suffered a blow, he'd stay committed to the cause.
Individual movements will come and go, groups will die, TikToks, whatever, but the base as a network will survive, and that's where we go back, regroup, and then, offshoots come from this. This has to be the nucleus of something bigger. Exactly.
Background Briefing sound producers are Lila Schunner and Ingrid Wagner.
Okay. Coming up next is a discussion on government by conscription, a democratic ballot, something I've been in favour of since I first read of it in Robert Heinlein's book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. So I'm just going to leave this running, and in 10-15 minutes when the news comes on, I'll have a bit of a rant about both topics. If you're still listening.
Subscribe to Background Briefing for free wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
And thanks very much to reporter Alex Mann for a fascinating report, especially those discussions with Cody. That was the second and final episode of the Base Tapes, and you can get both episodes of the Base Tapes on the Radio National website or wherever you get your podcasts. Next week, Background Briefing is back with a story about house prices as they skyrocket. We visit one of the few affordable big city caravan parks that people still call home.
If they did take this away, I'll be pretty sad because, like I was on Dire Strait, we had nowhere to go. I didn't want to go in a hotel, or a hotel would just cost too much. And this could be a last resort for many of those people who have fallen in the same situation as me.
That's next week's Background Briefing. Coming up though, should we switch from the ballot box to the bingo ball?
Hi, I'm Sana Kadar, and I'm your new host of All in the Mind here on
Sunday Extra is someone I came across via Malcolm Gladwell's excellent podcast, Revisionist History. Adam Cronkite is the co-coordinator of the American organization Of By For. The name, of course, is a reference to President Abraham Lincoln's description of democracy in the Gettysburg Address. And Of By For's mission is to free America from parties and politicians and make it so that government finally does right by its people. And the particular aspect of Adam Cronkite's work is his belief in and use of what he calls democratic lotteries, selecting representatives of the people via the method of a lottery. Adam Cronkite, welcome to Sunday Extra.
Thank you, Julian. It's great to be here.
Adam, we're so conditioned to a particular model for democratic elections, the voting booth where you choose from a list of candidates, the tallying of paper ballots. In that context, the idea of a democratic lottery sounds very novel, but it's not actually a new idea, is it?
No, actually, this was the original way to select representatives in a democracy, going back over 2,000 years to ancient Athens, where the word democracy comes from. And 2,500 years ago, they could see quite clearly what we see today, which is that elections tend to favor the rich, and they also breed corruption and division. And so, for the most part, they avoided elections, and instead, selected most public offices by lottery from the citizenry each year.
You can see the logic there, but also perhaps think that maybe that works for organisations on smaller scales. How do you apply the concept of a democratic lottery to the representation of really large numbers of people?
Well, the beauty of a democratic lottery is that it scales really well. And so these days in modern times, democratic lotteries use tools that have been developed and perfected over 100 years in the realm of public polling, right? And so a lottery can bring together a group of everyday people that is reflective and representative of the makeup of the broader population. And so it doesn't matter if the population is millions or even hundreds of millions, you can bring together in the same room a group of folks that reflects the population. So men and women, young and old, poor and rich and middle class, people who work different jobs, nurses and teachers and truckers and farmers, and all the different perspectives that make up a population. And you're able to get them into the same room together where they can do a deep dive looking into the issues that affect us. And so they can call on the testimony of a range of experts on an issue, they can hear from affected stakeholders, and they can work through differences together to arrive at common ground.
Now, Adam, you've recently been involved in applying this technique to an issue which very much affects everyone, which is COVID-19. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences with the Citizens Panel and dealing with policy questions around COVID-19?
Yeah, so the Citizens Panel on COVID-19 brought together 30 everyday Americans from all walks of life to try to find common ground on the pandemic and point a direction forward. And so we used the democratic lottery. They came together, they fielded testimony from a range of health and economic experts, worked through differences, and they developed 12 policy recommendations on health and the economy. And what you see with citizens' assemblies and citizens' panels the world over, when you take the politicians and the parties and all the politicking out of it and just get people together, they're able to talk with one another respectfully, see where each other's coming from, and they're able to agree on things. They don't agree on everything, but they mostly agree on most things, and they respect one another and care for one another in the process.
Can you just explain for us in a little bit more detail how, in fact, you convened and conducted this democratic lottery? You got 30 people onto the Citizens Panel. How exactly were they sourced?
Yeah, so democratic lotteries typically have 2 rounds. And so the first round of the lottery, you cast a very wide net, and you call on a huge group of people to serve. And those who are willing and able, you take them and their demographic information and also their political leanings, and you put them through a second round of lottery to end up with a group that reflects the population. And so in our case, we made sure that this group of 30 reflected the population in terms of gender and race and age and level of schooling, but also their political leanings and even their views on COVID and how much they thought COVID was a threat. And so you come out of that with a group of 30 that reflects the population. The beauty here too is that they come into this space, they didn't have to run campaigns. And so they come into it free of political debts, free of partisan pressures. They don't owe their position to any party or to any endorsement or to any donor. And so they can come into the space honestly and authentically, thinking about what's best for their fellow citizens.
And so just to be clear, because I was trying to get my head around how it is that selecting from a lottery will ensure an outcome which is reflective of the overall population. That's what you achieve by the second round of the lottery, is that right?
Yeah, because there's going to be, certain populations that might answer the call less frequently than others. And so that second round of the lottery is a way to correct for that and make sure that we never get a citizens panel or a citizens assembly, or a legislature that would be, 75% male and 25% female. It's always going to be 50-50. And the same goes for race, and it goes for education level and income, and etc.
We're speaking with Adam Cronkite, coordinator for the American not-for-profit of By4 about democratic lotteries. Adam, you ended up conducting your early work on democratic lotteries in Bolivia amongst student leaders. Can you tell us a bit about that experience?
Yeah, so we had a nonprofit called Democracy in Practice, myself and a Bolivian colleague and a few others, and we worked in schools in Bolivia replacing student elections with democratic lotteries to form student governments. And so you had student governments that were no longer the usual suspects. You know, it was truly a diverse group of students who came from the different social circles in the school, students who would never even think about running a campaign to get elected, let alone had a chance to win one because they weren't as charismatic or as popular. They weren't performers. And yet they were such good teammates. They were good listeners. They were good collaborators. They showed up. They did what they said they were going to do. They were leaders in the democratic sense. And what we found was, too, is that there were also students who would win a student election, who entered the lottery and occasionally be selected. And working over years in this, we saw that some of those students, the classically electable ones, the classic leaders, some of them were good teammates, but oftentimes they really struggled to be a part of the team. What they were good at was running a campaign. They were good performers, being on stage, but then they'd struggle to work together with others. And we found that it was so much easier to teach students who were good teammates and who worked well with others and actually cared about representing others to lose their fear of speaking in public than it was sometimes to reel in those very charismatic students and teach them to set aside their ego and to think about others.
You can very much see how that process of selection would produce a more representative body for consultation. But part of democratic government is also being in the executive, actually implementing policy and managing effectively. What has your work shown in terms of how leaders selected by democratic lottery perform in that sort of executive function?
It's a good question. So ourselves, we're not so interested in consultation. We believe that it's time to cut out the middlemen of parties and politicians. That said, to your question of the executive branch, lotteries are not to be used to select individual positions that require specialized knowledge and skill sets and experience, like an executive, like an administrator. But where lotteries can transform that process is turning it into a sensible hiring process instead of a circus election. And so you would use a democratic lottery to select everyday people from all walks of life to form a citizens hiring commission. And they would go out and field and vet and interview the most qualified administrators in the public and private sector. And they would end up with a short list of can't-miss candidates and either make the selection themselves or put it to the population for a vote, but without a campaign, without debates and attack ads. They'd simply present 5 can't-miss candidates and have the population take their pick. That to us is a sensible hiring process, like what you would see to select the CEO in any well-run organization, instead of these circus elections that are tearing apart our country.
Well, it's been great discussing the concept of democratic lotteries with you, Adam Cronkright. Thank you so much for joining us on Sunday Extra.
Thank you, Julian.
And Adam Cronkright is the coordinator of the American not-for-profit Of, By, For, and then...
Okay, well, we'll deal with government by conscription first. What Walter Cronkright failed to mention in so many words is that the way government is set up currently, you've either got a democracy or an autocracy. If you've got an autocracy, the underlying bedrock assumption is that one individual is smarter, more inspired, more competent than millions. And that's generally an invalid assumption. And if you build any structure on an invalid assumption, you get an invalid structure and it doesn't perform as expected or hoped or desired or intended. For example, have a go at building a concrete bridge using plaster of Paris instead of Portland cement. It'll look great until it rains. Invalid assumptions. The democracies, that's where you assume that a million or millions of individuals are wiser than one. And that's equally invalid. In practice, the multitudes tend to vote longer holidays, better working hours, more money per hour. They quite often stir themselves up into a wild, passionate rage about shit that really doesn't matter and isn't an issue, or is itself based on false assumptions. So democracies, autocracies, equally invalid. That's what's going on in the mess that surrounds the planet at the moment. However, as I mentioned in the science fiction novel written by Robert Heinlein titled The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, the plot line concerned the moon being used as a penal colony by the fascist government on Earth. So all your political malcontents, dissidents and loudmouths had been shipped to the moon. And one of the blokes who'd been on the moon for a long time was explaining to some new chums the idea behind government by conscription. And he said, the problem is that to get to the top in the autocracy, you basically join the military and you kiss up and you kick down until you're a brigadier general and you've got a bunch of tanks and some Air Force jets and a whole bunch of infantry at your disposal, and you shoot your way to the top. That's in the autocracies. Or you inherit the job, you know, like if 1,000 years ago you had a grandfather who was good at killing people, then you might still be the King of England. In the democracies, all of the prospective megalomaniacs have a bullshit contest where they stand up on their hind legs and they lie about how tunefully they can play the horn of plenty and what colours and flavours of milk and honey they can force it to produce. So both systems are essentially different ways of implementing the philosophy of harvest everythingism, by which the functioning ecology of the biosphere of planet Earth has been trashed systematically for 12,300 years, but that's kind of a different rave, and we'll do that another day. The fact is that in the democracies where you have megalomaniacs tell lies to get to the top, winning a popularity contest, or in the autocracies where you have the megalomaniacs shoot their way to the top, unless they inherit their way to the top, you wind up with people who are in charge of shit that they are absolutely out of their depth attempting to administer. They're good at getting to the top. They're not good at doing anything once they get there. So by contrast, there are other people in society who are smarter than our elected politicians or our appointed by fate, God, and the laws of war type tyrants. There are people who have better legal educations, better philosophical educations, better medical educations, better administrative educations than all of them. There are people who know how to budget and run a family on one income with 6 children and no vehicle, and they walk to work. There are people who are really ingenious at making a little bit go a long way. There are people who are good at not making messes in public places. And pretty much none of them ever try to get into politics because they can see from the get-go that it is a crock of corruption and nepotism and incestuous bullshit. So the people who are most suited to govern society almost never put their hand up and say, "Oh, I will be a politician. I will spend my whole life driving around telling the same speech to a different bunch of local yokels at different town halls within my little electorate. And I'll convince all of them that I will represent them in whatever it is that they're interested in on the day, and I'll shake their hands and look them in the eye and say, yes, no, 3 bags full. And then I'll go on and do it again in the next town and the next one and the next. And eventually I'll lie me way to the point where they all vote for me. Nobody with any real sort of force of character and grounding in morals and ethics and essential individual humility is going to stand still for that, so they don't. Whereas if everybody has their personal identification number, which is allocated at birth, goes on their Medicare card, and if it's a bit like the Vietnam conscription ballot. You know, I can remember my youngest sister was going to get hitched in about she got married in 67, but before that, they were going to announce their engagement and they had to wait until after the conscription ballot so that she could find out whether the boyfriend was going to have to join the military and go over to Vietnam and play hopscotch in the minefield for 12 months. They decided they would wait until after the conscription ballot to announce their engagement. He got to be left alone and he stayed home and went and had a life instead. And they're still married. But he didn't have any option on it, you know, like because he was born in a particular year, therefore his birthday was put on one of the little balls in the great big lotto basket. And one they just scooped up birthdays at random, and everybody who was born on that day in that year had to go off and take their army medical. And if there was no serious mental or physical reason, except if their parents paid a lot of money to certain places, send them to university. They could go overseas to a university and defer it. Most of our politicians who were of age to have served in Vietnam, they didn't. Most of our politicians in Australia, they were at Cambridge doing a Rhodes Scholarship or something at the time. But with government by conscription, there are no excuses. Everybody from age 18 to age 60 is in the ballot. If your name comes up, you have been selected for government and you will serve a 6-year term. And it doesn't matter if you're a doctor, and it doesn't matter if you're a millionaire, and it doesn't matter if you're a dole bludger. You have been statistically randomly selected by a random number generator to go off and spend 6 years in government. And every 3 years, half the government gets replaced by ballot. So when the new mob comes in, for each person who's completely bewildered by the changes and what they're expected to suddenly come up to speed on, there's somebody who's already been doing it for 3 years. You put them all in one room, and a bit like the town council, the councillors elect the mayor and the deputy mayor. So the people who've been selected to be in the government, they elect their leader, and they form committees of people who are good at various things that need to be administered, and off they go. And yes, absolutely, certainly, you're going to get probably 10 or 15% of them who are no bloody good at anything, because that's reflective of society. They can do what they're told, but they can't think up anything for themselves. But on the other hand, you're going to get 20% of them are going to be really smart. And you're going to catch the 1 or 2% who are actual, you know, serious out of the box, score over 200 on an IQ test, like Barry Jones. Barry Jones had a calculated IQ of 265 because he kept acing the IQ tests. So they made him sit an IQ test and they cut him off at the half-time limit, scored the test and doubled his score, and he had an IQ of 265. He was our Minister for Science and Industries in the Hawke government under the Labor Party. His rise to prominence was on a TV quiz program called BP Pickerbox. He used to correct the TV authorities because their encyclopedia was wrong. Instead of getting one of them every half century in government, you'd get all of them who are in society at a representative proportion. So in a nation or a world which was ruled by government by conscription, the government would actually represent the population. You wouldn't get these incompetent fucking megalomaniacs floating to the top like scum on a sewerage pot. Life would be better organised. We wouldn't be in this fucking anthropogenic global warming shit fight to disaster that's going on at the moment, where even though the science has been nailed down for over 100 years, everybody understands that if you just keep emitting carbon dioxide to the sky, then everything warms up. There's more energy in all of the weather and it becomes unlivable, particularly as an organised industrial civilization. Yes, see? We're now starting to bring in the Crimson Rosellas for the discussion. So, wouldn't it be lovely if instead of persisting with democracy and autocracy, wouldn't it be lovely if we perhaps moved on a bit and tried government by conscription or government by lottery? It makes more sense. It makes a lot more sense. To my way of thinking, a representative democratic government that reflects the makeup of society. And if you've got 1% of society are Nazis or neo-Nazis, like they were talking about with the base, well, okay, you'll get 1% of the neo-Nazis in government. You wouldn't get people like there's one member of parliament in New South Wales who, according to hearsay, pretty much had to leave the boarding school he was at because of the glowing terms in which he portrayed Adolf Hitler during a social history project where he was supposed to hand in an assignment on great political leaders of the 20th century. And poor little darling was bullied, and the school staff neglected to protect the bullied victim because they could see why anybody might want to punch a Nazi. And yeah, that fella has risen to the top. And the only reason I don't mention his name is because we do have defamation laws in Australia, and they're pretty strict. And if I was to mention his name without being able to prove it, I couldn't then demonstrate that it was in the public interest that I mentioned the fella's name. But there is one of whom I have been told, but it's hearsay. And hearsay is not admissible in court, so therefore you shouldn't actually rely on it in a public forum. But yeah, we get fascist mindsets attracted to government under any system, whether it's a democracy or an autocracy. And I think the only way to filter out the control freaks, the people who think that their way of looking at the world is so good that it should be enforced at gunpoint onto everybody who disagrees. And it's probably because, they might have an IQ of 110 perhaps, which means that, say, 90% of the people they ever meet are not as smart as they are. And they convince themselves that anybody who appears to be smarter is actually just a dickhead. And anybody who disagrees with them is a dickhead. So they then further the idea and they tell themselves that they are the smartest people in existence. They get a really high opinion of themselves, and that's why you get individuals who describe themselves as belonging to the master race. They consider that planet Earth has been constructed solely for their benefit, for their use as a plaything. Those people are attracted to the idea of getting a job where they can be paid to tell other people what to do. I consider that they're overcompensated inferiority complexes on legs. They have a hole in their self-esteem, probably dating to when they didn't get enough cuddles when they were supposed to be being breastfed, particularly daddy cuddles. They show up at kindergarten and they see somebody else who's smiling and happy and they go over and they punch them. And that way, the nasty little bully has got someone who can be seen to be less happy. Look, see, you're crying, ha ha, I'm okay. And they gravitate into positions of power and authority under our system. So yeah, government by ballot or government by conscription would be a really good idea. Interesting that the 21-year-old wannabe base member neo-Nazi who was the most vociferous in his racism and his ranting, he turned out to be the one who was apparently most contrite when he came to his senses. Kind of interesting. And the idea that Nazism is attractive to teenage boys who looking for something to hitch their wagon to, it's probably shouldn't be surprising. I can remember being a youngster and being absolutely wrapped in the whole idea of air combat And because the Germans had the most efficient, most proficient, highest scoring air combat aces, particularly in the Second World War, I took quite a shine to the idea of the German Second World War military. And yeah, the whole idea was great until you start reading about the concentration camps and the massacres and the death toll. And then you start paying attention to how every time Hitler had a chance to actually win against England or Russia or America, he'd do the other thing. You know, like instead of invading Malta or Gibraltar, he invaded Russia. There are people who say that if Adolf Hitler had had modern communications, World War II would have ended in 1942. The only reason it lasted as long as it did was because his generals, who were actually educated at what they were supposed to be doing on the German general staff, they were out of touch with Hitler, so they could get off the leash and they could do things that were going to work. So the whole Nazi system of ideology-driven government, it was a crock of shit. It meant that bullshit artists and ass kissers got put into positions of authority based on their political reliability and their loyalty. And it was all held together by propaganda that was cobbled up by Herr Dr. Joseph Goebbels, PhD. He was inspired by, ironically, a Jewish-owned public relations advertising firm in New York who had taken a contract from the American government to turn around American opinion in 1917 to get the American masses behind the idea of America joining the war on the side of England and France against Germany at a time when something like 60% of America wanted to stay out of the war and 30% wanted them to join on the German side because they had German ancestry. Took 6 months. In his diary, Goebbels rants about it. It goes on for pages about how it all works. And that's the point in his diary where he mentions that according to the science of propaganda, if one has sufficient knowledge of the population and if one has sufficient repetition of the message, it is perfectly possible to convince the people, or to prove, as he said, that a circle is a square, because circle and square are words and words are symbols and symbols have variable meanings. And if you think about it, that's why the people who only watch one news source, like Fox, One American News, Breitbart, they only watch one news source, they only pay attention to one point of view, and the people who are pumping that point of view out, they consider that they fully, absolutely, totally understand their own audience. And they don't bother attempting to appeal to anybody else. They tight beam it into the minds of the people who are stuck in the kettle. And what it's done in the excited status is it's balkanised the population. And you've got all these people who never listen to anybody who doesn't think what they think, and therefore they think that what they think is the majority view, no matter how minor their perspective actually is in a grand scheme of things. Once again, government by conscription, by random number generators and your Medicare number. It'll fix all that. Because at the moment, something like 75 or 80% of humanity wants our governments to do something efficient and effective and fast and serious about anthropogenic global warming, and our governments are in the grip of the fossil fuel industry and the people who have lent money to manufactories and transport industries who expect to make money and pay off their debts by selling bright and shiny landfill to the fucking idiots who live in the towns and the suburbs who spend their whole life worrying about who's going to win the football game next week, or whether blue or red or green is going to be the fashionable colour in the next approaching season. The politicians don't believe that they can get away with saying to the people in the suburbs, I'm sorry, you guys are going to have to cut your standard of living dramatically, and even then the weather's going to get worse for 25 years after we stop emitting fossil carbon to the atmosphere, because that's what greenhouse gases do. They keep on warming until they have been locked up in some other chemical reaction. This is why I say that if Andropov and Reagan had have nuked the planet in 1984, 55% of all the fossil carbon that humanity has dug out of the ground and pumped into the sky from 1750 until today, 55% of it would be safely still under the ground if Reagan and Andropov or Reagan and Gorbachev had have nuked the Northern Hemisphere back to the Stone Age in 1984 and shut down the global vile age's industrial scale extraction and burning of fossil fuel. And if they'd done that, anthropogenic global warming would have mostly, 95% of the effects would be over 10 years ago. And by shutting down industrial population growth in the mid-80s, there would at the moment be probably 90% more remaining biological reserve. Habitat destruction and mass species extinction have continued on a considerable distance since 1984. And if you have a look at the forbidden zone around Chernobyl, you'll see that if you remove the humans from the equation, then wildlife can cope with radioactive fallout remarkably well. So planet Earth would have been in a much better state if the Warsaw Pact and NATO had have nuked the shit out of each other back in the mid-80s. I don't know whether I would be around today to be pondering the question, but planet Earth would be in a better situation. And I would wager that civilization would have had a better, and culture would have had a better chance of maintaining itself if it was rebuilding from nuclear war in 1984 rather than attempting to survive whatever the weather's going to do in the next 25 years or more, because, it's only a fortnight since, boo-hoo, sob, the Suez Canal has been blocked by a 400-metre long container ship taking bright, shiny landfill from China to Europe. 15% of global trade has been forced to stop and scratch its head for a week, and it's $10 billion a day, and the oil prices are up because it can't get there. Most of the 8 billion are scratching their heads and worried about global warming, but meanwhile they're doing everything that they possibly can to get ahead, to make more money next year than they made this year. They don't regard Bat Eater's Lament virus as a smack across the face and a reason to sit back and rethink and maybe stop trying to grow the bloody economy, stop trying to grow the population, stop trying to be more, quote, productive, stop trying to dig more dirt out of the ground to burn on different dirt so that you can make more bright, shiny landfill every year and sell it to more people in more countries. It's like they just haven't got the fucking message. So the idea that you've got apprentice plumbers and fucking qualified composite technologists who can build themselves a fiberglass boat, telling themselves that they are the master race and what they need to do is get, 6 of them together to recruit other disaffected dickheads and then go and paint SWAT stickers on the local mosque or the synagogue, and that's going to fix the world. That'll bring back prosperity to their suburban street. Oh, these fucking idiots. Complete fucking idiots. We're surrounded by them. Absolutely surrounded by them. And there's more of them than there is non-fucking idiots, people who can understand basically the length and breadth and momentum of humanity's erroneousness, the number of things that we're fucking up all at once. It's like taking a monkey and putting them in a cockpit of a jumbo jet and then making the monkey have an epileptic fit. Fucking push, pull, step, tread, and yank on every knob, lever, switch, and button in the cockpit. And that's what humanity has done to the biosphere's atmospheric homeostasis mechanisms. Everything which used to work under the Gaia principle to maintain conditions so that the maximum number of species could coexist together and everything would work to stabilise the planet's climate, that's been buggered with a barbed wire dildo for the fun of it. It's like the story where there was an intergenerational starship put together so cleverly that the engine room was inaccessible from the crew quarters, and all the crew had to do was eat, drink, philosophise, try not to annoy each other. And they fly through the universe, and it's all self-sustaining and self-operating and self-maintaining. And then some of the crew went mad, and they decided what they wanted to do was chop down the air recyclers and then dig up the food and water recyclers and then burn the air recyclers in order to get the heat to melt down the food and water recyclers so they could make jewellery and sell it to each other, and then they could call each other rich. Well, the air recyclers are things called trees, and the food and the water recyclers is stuff called topsoil, ground cover, water, hydrological cycles, soil bacteria, soil fertility, microorganisms, ecologies. And that's what's going on. The sun is the engine room of the solar system. We, on Mudball 3, are in the living quarters. And 12,500 years ago, a small faction among our ancestors went fucking mad and decided to harvest everything. And when they run out and created a desert, they pissed off. And they brought their planet fucking ways to somebody who'd been taking better care of their resources. Ah, virgin wilderness, unspoiled lands. Let's go and man-age this to make it more productive, to squeeze its ducts, make more milk flow from its tits. Productivity. When we turn that into a fucking desert, then we just expand another ring outwards. Have a look at a satellite map of planet Earth with all the clouds stripped off. Have a look at southeastern Turkey where Göbekli Tepe used to be, and the ruins now are. And then just visualise the civilization and the desert spreading out, as shown by the bare dirt on the satellite photo. It's not hard to see what's going on and what's coming. There's going to be a bottleneck. We are not paying attention, therefore the various waves of bat eater virus. First there was Marburg virus, killed 99%. Whole villages died out before anyone could run away and give it to anybody else. How do you get it? Go and hunt down a sick, tired, hungry flying fox. One whose viral load is multiplied so that viruses that normally the bat could keep down to $1 are all through its bloodstream, and then you try and eat that bat. And anybody who gets in your body fluid on them, they'll die from it too. But it was too deadly, so then there was Ebola. Only kills sort of 90% if they get no treatment and 60% if they do get treated. That spreads better. And as people hack down the rainforest to spread their civilization and their entrepreneurial progress. Four-wheel drive loads of otherwise unemployed young men with families to support with a couple of shotguns drive out and find the last lonely tree that's been left by the Clearfell loggers. The tree will be absolutely decked with bats. There'll be a bat at the top of the tree that keeps an eye out, sees the four-wheel drives coming from 4 different directions. All the healthiest bats fly away from the tree. The ones that are sickest, tiredest, hungriest, got the highest viral loads, they can't be bothered flying away. So they just hang upside down in the tree and let themselves be shotgunned onto the ground. They get put in eskies. The eskies go in the four-wheel drives. The four-wheel drives take it to the crossroads. They sell the freshly dead bats to the truck drivers who take it into the cities, who sell it to the restaurateurs. The restaurateurs, they sell it to the yuppies who want to demonstrate their status by eating expensive bush meat. So Ebola keeps appearing. MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, the bat shit gets into the camel feed. The camel gets sick. Camel kisser comes and hugs his $1 million camel, the racing camel that won him all those cups. And then the camel kisser gets sick. Hendra virus, horse kisser's disease. Property developer cuts down the forest that's regrown on the failed dairy farm in the Queensland Gold Coast hinterland, sells it for 5-acre hobby farms, and there's one shade tree in the paddock, and that's where the starving bats come and hang out in the tree, and that's where the hobby farmer puts the Black Beauty Fantasies horse trough and feed rack, so the bat shit gets in the horse feed under the shade tree. And then the horse gets sick and the horse kisser goes and cuddles the dying horse, and then the horse kisser goes to hospital and dies a fortnight afterwards. And in Wuhan, they were netting microbats, stressing them out, keeping them in little bird cages and selling them to be deep fried and used as soup croutons. The bats are getting more and more serious. I suppose if the English variety of COVID-19 could meet up with Ebola and you could get airborne Ebola, that'd bloody weed us out, wouldn't it? That would weed us out. But I suppose one of the best bright sides of COVID is that it's had a continuing major impact on airline travel movements. And that means it's cut down the contrails. And as we learnt in New Scientist in last week's broadcast, 57% of the atmospheric warming caused by burning jet fuel at altitude is caused by the contrail rather than the carbon dioxide. So keeping the jets on the ground, that should have disproportionately reduced the warming effect of attempts to regrow the tourism industry. Every time anybody thinks they've got COVID under control, they immediately attempt to reboot their tourism and service industry. And of course, it all goes to pot and they get new cases. But yeah, cutting out the airlines, that is possibly the most atmospherically effective fossil fuel to shut off first. Because if you burnt that same jet fuel at ground level, it would only cause 34% of the warming that it does if you burn it at 30,000 feet or 10,000 metres. Anyway, that's a fairly overlong video. I probably should shut up at this point. Part 2 of the base, government by conscription and WarbleRant. You have a good Sunday. Ciao.